Welcome everyone to the Friday Lunch Forum. I'm Leora Vysotsky. I'm the staff managing director at the center, which is also run by a faculty board of directors from across our disciplines. This year, our board consists of Fernando Lara, Miriam Solis, Martin Hadish, Nerea Feliz, and Alex Yeshka. Here's hoping to be giving you real sandwiches someday soon. If you are visiting today for the open house, we normally feed you when we hold these events in person, so look forward to that. Lunch forums are really meant to be more informal presentations and opportunities for faculty and students to share works in progress, new directions for their research, or what it's like to straddle academia and practice and how the two inform one another, which is, I think, some of what we'll hear about today. So in order to facilitate that, our presenter will speak for about 45 minutes, after which we'll open the floor to questions and discussion. So please, I encourage you to raise your hand, put a question or comment in the chat just as they arise, and we will get to them at the end. I am super pleased today to introduce our presenter, Awais Azhar. Awais is a community and regional planning PhD student and TA at the School of Architecture. His research focuses on affordable housing, eviction, racial capitalism, and financialization. Awais is an affordable housing, homelessness, and social justice advocate. He currently serves on the City of Austin Planning Commission, the leadership team of Planning Our Communities, the steering committee of the ATX Mobility Coalition, the Homelessness Continuum of Care Membership Council, the Housing Works Austin Board, and the Austin Housing Coalition Executive Committee. Wow. In the past, he also served on the governing board of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, the LGBTQI+ Census Complete Count Committee, the Equality Texas Board, the City of Austin LGBTQ Quality of Life Advisory Commission, the City of Austin Community Development Commission, and the Community Advancement Network Dashboard Steering Committee. I don't know how you have time to do any of your schoolwork. That's amazing. Awais worked as research coordinator and program manager for the Austin Community Investment Collaborative at Housing Works Austin. He holds a Master of Science in Community and Regional Planning and a Master of Public Affairs from the University of Texas at Austin, and a Bachelor of Architecture from the National College of Arts in Lahore. Welcome, Awais. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk here and for that great introduction, which I feel like I should have given you a little less to talk, but I appreciate it. And thank you all for being here. So I'll get started and I'll share my screen. And hopefully folks can tell me when you can see it all perfectly. Hopefully that's clear. Great. So what I'm talking about today is essentially a lot of things that are sort of roaming around in my mind because of the kind of advocacy work and other things that I'm doing out in the community and trying to bring that together with the research that I'm doing and also what I'm teaching and how I'm engaging within the academy itself. So a lot of it is coming together in this conversation. What I wanted to focus on was this question of who is community? Dispelling dishonest conceptions of community engagement. Essentially, I feel like there's a lot of conversation around how we need to engage with the community, particularly in planning, but I know also within design, particularly in the design justice movement. But at the same time, we're not always doing justice to that conversation around engagement and what that looks like. And so I'm going to start off there. And just to sort of frame this, I did want to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing out in the community and how that engages with this work. And you'll see this little arrow on the side, which is my way of indicating sort of the least ingrained engagement to the most sort of broad engagement that I'm doing in my own work, with the understanding that these categorizations are not as simple or smooth, things flow and move. It's a lot more complicated, but just to simplify the kind of conversation that I'm having here. So I serve on the Planning Commission as the mayor's appointee, and I worked on the Land Development Code Affordable Housing Working Group. And in some ways, I found this is the place where we engage the least, in the sense that we engage in one of the most meaningless ways. So what we get is public testimony. When we're hearing a case and when we're doing the LDC, it's like a broad conversation, anyone coming, signing up following certain protocols and rules. Right now, it's about joining things virtually and getting on a phone and then being part of that conversation. And we give them very small amounts of time in which to testify. So it's really one of the most strict ways in which we engage with people, but it remains a way to collect sort of feedback is the idea. Beyond that was the LGBTQ Quality of Life Advisory Commission. So similar to a commission, but there were less rules in how we can engage with the community. So we were able to do a budget town hall. We were able to have more conversations with folks beyond simply asking them questions on a specific item. And we could engage in a more meaningful way with the community. Same goes for the work I was doing then as part of the Joint Inclusion Committee, which was looking at our quality of life commissions broadly, like African American, Latino, Hispanic, Asian American, and LGBTQ, with a lot of other marginalized communities as a part of that conversation. I'm also currently serving on Capital Metro's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and that sort of difference, that's sort of the flip at that point. I'm no longer in a decision-making role of any aspect, but I am part of this panel that is advising Capital Metro on their diversity, equity, and inclusion planning that they're doing internally. And part of the way that works is that I would say we're a group of community leaders, or I would at least say they were grass top leaders. I would never say they were the grassroots, because the work that we're trying to do here is definitely informed by the work that we're doing in the communities, but at the same time, this is not expansive. Most of the folks here are very involved in these conversations already. Below this, I was looking at the housing advocacy piece, my work with different housing organizations, and that is where I've been on the other side of that testimony, where I've gone and had my 2 or 3 minutes, I prepared comments, I talk, and what does that feel like? So being on both sides of that dais, essentially, being on the listening side, but also on the speaking side, and the challenges that you face with it. So believe me, I've sat on the phone for 8 hours waiting for my turn to come up, and trying to do other things in the meanwhile. Then there's sort of the ADX Mobility Coalition, where we're working on Project Connect with sort of great partners there, a number of community partners and organizations. And lastly, Planning Our Communities, which was an organization that I started with a bunch of leaders of color 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. And the work we're doing there with Eviction Solidarity Network. So essentially, that is where we're really going and working with communities, a number of different pieces throughout the city, a number of different conversations we have with the South Congress contact team, East MLK area and the neighborhoods there, the work that they're doing in Colony Park, Georgian Acres, also looking at Runberg, North Lamar. So a lot of that kind of work that's really at that point ingrained, working in a more honest and engaged way with the community. So essentially, I say this all to talk a little bit about what is coming next in terms of what I'm seeing, and then also to explain why this is sort of close to me and why I'm engaging with this. Because my conception here is definitely being an insider and outsider. So somebody who's engaged in planning, who's studying planning, who has studied planning and teaching planning at times, and then also the person who's on the other end of what that planning structure looks like. So I dug into, and you all will have to bear with me here for a bit, because I'm going to go through the slides and there'll be some nice visuals. The biggest thing was really looking at, well, how do we describe in our fields what this engagement looked like? So I looked at the American Institute of Certified Planners, Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, and I pulled out the various things I thought talked about working with the public. So what I saw was, that our primary obligation was serving with the public interest, that planners have to work to conscientiously attain concepts of public interest that is formulated through continuous and open debate. No more description beyond that. That we shall be providing timely, adequate, clear, and accurate information, that planners must give people the opportunity to have a meaningful impact on the development of plans and programs that may affect them, and that participation should be broad enough to include those who are generally not included in these conversations. And lastly, the planners must deal fairly with all participants. So again, this is part of the code of ethics of our field, giving us the signal on what do we have to do as ethical planners. I looked at the American Institute of Architects Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, and there I found sort of like even less detail, a lot less talking about directly about engaging with communities, even though I know that design justice and community engaged design is becoming such a big aspect of the field. And what I did see was sort of these other pieces that I thought could lead to that conversation. One was that architects should not engage in wanton disregard for the right of others. And I think that would include the right of others to be included in design processes, designing for human dignity, right, and welfare of the public. Now, I think this is really focused on not designing for prolonged incarceration or robbing someone of life, but really design for human dignity includes that aspect of participation. At least that is the way how I was looking at it. And then lastly, embracing the spirit and letter of the law and promoting and serving the public interest in capacities as architects and designers. And I thought that again sort of leads this conversational engagement. So again, this was really looking at what are our fields telling us that we should be doing and what is engagement, because it can be big. So I use these to frame some of the conceptions that we have around engagement. A lot of them come from the side of planning, but then also bring in the architecture side and design side as well. So the first one was like really, public interest is conscientiously attained through continuous and open debate. And this was an interesting one, right? There's this notion that if we get folks in a room and they will talk it out and they will come to this perfect conclusion, we will have the solutions that we need and we will all agree on them and they will be perfect in all ways and we can move forward. And really it is about this sort of open debate. And I guess I hate to break the news to a lot of people who already know it, but life just doesn't work that way. And what we see is that there is no public interest, but rather interests. And there is no one public, but there are publics, right? There's not a community for community engagement, there's communities for communities engagement. And so really talking about what does that look like? We were going through the City of Austin was going through its land development code rewrite. And part of that work was the neighborhoods providing information on it. And one of the things that came out very clearly during this time was that there is no one conception of one's own neighborhood. So this is an article from 2015 from CAAD. It was talking about the competing Hyde Parkers. At the time, Hyde Park formed a alternative neighborhood association. So they'd had a contact team and a neighborhood association that is very old and historical and is engaged in a lot of the work around Hyde Park. And then Friends of Hyde Park was formed around that time as sort of an alternative neighborhood association. I should say we're seeing this across different neighborhoods throughout our city at this point. Zilker has a flip one, downtown has a different one. And so we're seeing these sort of multiply. And just to sort of pull out these two examples of policy, and I don't want to dig into the detail of the policy, but essentially just talking about the fact that the existing sort of neighborhood structures, we're talking about how this one tool will decrease affordability and livability. And at the very same time, the other neighborhood organization was talking about the exact opposite and saying that this tool is probably one of the primary causes for why we are losing a more affordable housing stock. So really for the same exact tool within the code, one group of neighbors are saying that this will decrease affordability if we get rid of it, and one is saying that this is actually the reason for decreased affordability and we need to get rid of it. And so really talking about the fact that getting these folks in a room and doing some sort of conscientious attainment to debate is not going to be just the way to move forward with this. It requires a more intentional process to have those conversations, and then also really understanding that there will or may not be any agreements moving forward. And we'll sort of have to live with that. And how does that work? Because there are multiple viewpoints within any conversation that is as complex as what we have within planning and design. So really, again, against the conception of conscientiously attaining to continuous and open debate. The second was this providing timely, adequate, clear, and accurate information is enough. And I can tell you, it is not enough. Providing information alone just becomes part of either tokenization or telling folks what we want them to do. And we see this done from structures all the time. So an example was the Hancock Golf Course is currently going through a review. Their planning staff did a survey, collected some information, put out their idea of what they should do. And they're talking about privatizing the golf course and working with a contractor to essentially contract it out and privatize the space with no clear indication of what that would look like. And so some of the community groups that I'm working with were saying, really go out there, have your voice heard, because what we're seeing here is that a department has made its sort of idea on what they think makes sense here, what is fiscally responsible, what goes with sort of the values of the Parks and Recreation Department, what they had seen in the national report. And then they're sort of sharing that information out with the community. And very quickly, they've gotten different backlash for this. And I know they're having a little tough time dealing with this right now, but it still seems like sort of charging forward with an idea that has already been made and is now being shared with people. And so essentially providing that information is not enough. Not to mention the fact that words like timely and adequate and clear and accurate, there's so many ways to conceptualize that and think about those, and it's really hard to think through. Another conception that comes up and came up, in our sort of guiding code of ethics, that board participation automatically includes those who lack influence, right? I'm going back to Ornstein, sort of the mother of this work, and looking at what she calls the have-nots. And so the have-nots will automatically become involved if you do broad enough participation. So what does this broad enough participation look like? One thing that we do is these large town hall events. So for the land development code, there was this big sort of marathon day of public testimony where people signed up. I'm going to forget what the exact number was, but there were around more than 300 speakers, and I think 400 people signed up. And I was there, so many folks were there who I know. And what did this broad participation effort lead to? So Audrey McGlinchey at KUT did this really great thing while we were all testifying. The moment you would come back from the dais, she would run up to you and ask you some demographic information. And she pulled us together in an article where she essentially said that white homeowners dominated over the entire conversation. And so she pulls this data on who spoke on this sort of broad participation principle. And it was largely white people, even though they are the minority in the city of Austin. They were largely homeowners, even though homeowners are the minority in the city of Austin. And renters were way underrepresented in this conversation. She further looked at who sort of went against and for the land development code. And what she saw was that particularly when we looked at median age, the majority of the people who were voting against were actually older Austinites versus younger Austinites. And the for was kind of really in parity with what the Austin's population looks like. So essentially that again talks about that broad participation leading to some inequities. And same goes for homeowners and renters, where homeowners largely spoke against, renters who are already underrepresented in the sample voted or spoke for the item itself. And so again, that conception of broad participation will somehow lead to equitable engagement does not really pan out. And we see this with surveys too. There's a lot of conversation about, well, one way to do the broad one is to put out a survey. Well, you need technological access. You have to have access to different kinds of information to get to that point of engaging with it. You might not have the words to explain what you're trying to say. You might be used culturally and historically to have conversations. So again, this conception of the broad engagement strategy, making sure the have-nots will have a say, does not always pan out. The third, not third, I'm not going to remember which one it is, but the fairness, and there's another conception, I think it's the fourth, so the fairness and even-handedness will overcome structural gaps. So that if we're, as long as planners and architects are fair and even-handed, we can overcome structural gaps. Again, structural gaps are larger, the structural inequities within our society that are built through historical structures and very durable historical structures, and you don't really get rid of them. So what I was looking here was, I was involved with the Colony Park Sustainable Communities Initiative. This was in 2014. They did a big design process for Colony Park, which is a historical African-American neighborhood in East Austin. And Douglas Farr Associates was involved with the design of this. And they really tried to get people in the room and treat everything fairly. There was a lot of that sort of like, sticky dots and little comments and walking around in this map and looking at it, a lot of those kind of engagement. It was very engaging. And I remember a particular moment where they did this exercise where the community could choose what item do they want in their park. And so they had clickers, they could vote on them. Again, fairness and even-handed, everybody was taught how to use the clicker. Everyone is handed a clicker. And people start voting on what they want in the park, and slowly the dog park rises to the top. And I'm standing there with some of the other community engagement team. We're looking at each other. We're saying, not sure what is happening, right? This is an older African-American community that has for a very long time talked about the things they want for their youth and the track that they want for walking around. And the Latino Hispanic communities as children has talked about having a playground. And yet their dog park rises to the top. And you look around the room and what you see is that what's happened is that the neighborhood, adjoining this neighborhood, the Agave neighborhood, they had turned out in large droves to this meeting because they had heard about the meeting and were involved in the conversation. And it was largely younger, affluent, white homeowners in this adjoining neighborhood. And they were assumedly one of the people who were making this number go up. So again, that fairness and even-handedness in that moment was not helping really the community shape what it wanted to say. And that structural gap of who gets to be in these meetings, who gets to be part of these conversations historically, who has needs that have been met historically and whose needs have not been met historically, right? There's folks here who are asking for a literally a track so they can exercise. They're seniors, and there's folks who are looking for a dog park. That is not to say a dog park is not needed maybe for that community, but how do we overcome these structural gaps between race, income, and tenure? The other thing is looking at this conception of that as long as we follow the law, we can ensure that fairness happens and we can mitigate all harm. An example I will give here is the work that I'm involved with, the Project the Net conversation. So a lot of you might have heard, last year we passed a bond election, which essentially allows us to go for, and I want to say $8.7 billion transit infrastructure investment that will lead to this amazing infrastructure network, as can be seen on the right of the screen here. And part of this will be the National Environmental Policy Act process, or the NEPA process, which looks at environmental aspects, but also actually brings in environmental justice and community principles. And this is the work that was presented by Capital Metro. So you can look at what they're seeing in terms of NEPA process. And one of the big things they're saying is that this NEPA process is part of consensus building. And if we go through this law and all of its acts, which includes things like evaluation of alternatives, selection of a locally preferred alternative, environmental impact statement, and record of decision, and so on, these really technical legal terms, we will somehow build consensus through this process. And I'll be honest, I'm left a little flabbergasted why they would think this is possible, or that this legal process is the way to build consensus, or this legal process is the way to make sure that this will be an equitable infrastructure project. And I can tell you that that is not my opinion, that it would be. And so I was working with the ATX Mobility Coalition to pull through other pieces and really talk about how can we make this equity. And so we talked about including something that we call the equity tool, something that we talked about in terms of having these triggers for key performance indicators around equity, making sure there were public comment periods. Essentially, just following the law here will not lead to the fairness and the mitigation of anti-displacement or displacement that we want. So the last conception I have here did not necessarily come from those two code of ethics, but I think is important, and I see this all the time, and in some ways relates to some of those other conceptions, which is that focusing on race and racialized groups is against fairness. So if we really say that we're leading with race in mind, or that we want to prioritize a historic Black community to have the most say, we're somehow not being fair. And what this does not take into account is, again, those structural inequities that have been built in, and how do we take them forward? And again, the example that I'm going to give here is from the work that I did in Colony Park. So Colony Park, there was this conversation. It was a bit of a blow up. If anybody was ever there, I think some folks here knew about it. Other folks might not have been in the city at the time. But there was this long process and a community engagement process, and there were 4 big key meetings that were being led by this large team of engagement specialists and designers and environmental engineers and city folks and planners. And they went very poorly. There were 4 meetings, and each and every one, the community would get up and get really angry and upset, and they would talk about how the city of Austin neglected them for decades, how they don't have a grocery store, how they didn't get a park, even though they've been sitting on this empty public property forever. There was a lot of this sort of angst. And again, right, like the conversation was always, well, planning principles and talking about how do we make it more inclusive and compact and connected. And we're talking about new urbanism. And you can look at the image on the right, like these ideas of we're going to have like little pocket parks and taco trucks. And it's going to be a great little space for people to walk and engage in. And there was still so much pushback that kept on happening. And the last meeting, Doug Farr gets up and talks about the 928 plan. So he talks about, the racialized history of Austin, how East Austinites, particularly Black East Austinites, have, faced extreme amounts of racism, structural inequities, segregation, disinvestment, lack of inclusion. And the tenor of the conversation just completely changes. Folks, after you start engaging, people stand up and say, thank you. We appreciate what you just said, and you're at last like hearing what we're saying and what we've lived through. Sad part, it was the fourth of 4 community engagement meetings. So the formal community engagement process after that ended. But at the same time, not sort of being intentional about race and the groups that have been racialized in this country, it did not lead to fairness. It did not even lead to good engagement. It really led to disengagement over time until that could be corrected. So I guess the question is, where do we go from here? I don't want to just sit here and tell, I talked about this talk with friends and they were like, don't just talk about, what not to do, but really what to do. But before we go to the what to do, I really want to hit on a few sort of words of caution. One, whatever I've talked about so far is not to say that community engagement is not critical and necessary. I don't want folks to walk away from here and say, oh, well, there's no good way to engage. It just never works and we're going to cause harm. So we should just really stop community engagement processes. And that is not what I'm saying here at all, but rather saying that they're very critical and necessary and require intentionality. Secondly, there's no template for community engagement, so no quick solutions. A lot of folks want like a template checklist that they can look at and they can say, this is what we need to do good community engagement. And that's just not how it works. And part of that is because engagement is very contingent, is different across geographies and situations and times. So really it is dependent on where you are and what you are. And again, there's an intentionality that is required to engage with that moment. We also have to understand that planning and design are often functions of the state or the elite or the capital class, and thus they're mired in structural inequities. And so often when we're coming at these from these areas of sort of state privilege, we are definitely part of the structural inequity and we need to understand that. So to say that community engagement is critical, I think community organizing is even more critical, and the work that people are doing on the ground. And that we alone within sort of the system cannot solve the entire issue or engage with communities in a full way. So we have to understand that piece, that we're not here to provide all the solutions. I really want to say, because there's a lot of students here, that your best ideas and plans will often be ignored or sidelined. I completely understand that most of us will work in planning departments where we will not be the ones making decisions. And so recognizing that is important as well, that you're going to do your work and sometimes it's not going to work out. But the biggest thing is sort of to learn as you go and aspire for better. So again, not to scrap community engagement, but really aspiring for better and making sure that we're meaningfully engaging community members. So where do we go from here? The first one is that question of like, who is community? I get very annoyed on a personal level when people talk about, oh, we need to engage the community. The community has spoken. The community will tell us what needs to be done. But I think, this should come as no surprise to anyone that there is no singular community. There are communities. It is a multiple of voices and beliefs and histories and lived experience and opinions and strategies, and balancing all of that is critical in this conversation. I also personally think that it is racist when people say, oh, well, the POC community will tell us, right? So people of color will tell us, or the people of color have said, or the Black community wants this, or even within communities of color, we have multiple opinions, right? And I don't need to say this, but I'm going to say it. People of color, like white people, are complex human beings with multiple opinions, multiple lived experiences and histories and what they bring to the table, or even when there is no table, right? And they engage in that conversation. So talking about singular communities is essentially detrimental to these conversations. So you have to talk about these plural narratives and balancing them at the same time. Consensus is not the aim. So this for me is an important part of it. Part of that sort of conversation around, you get people in a room and you work with them and you eventually end up with this beautiful consensus and you can move forward from there. Consensus should not be the aim. If we believe that there are plural opinions, then we have to understand that the idea for engagement or any kind of community engagement is not to bring them together into consensus, but really sort of taking through all of those different pieces and stitching them together into a meaningful way of moving forward. And that's complicated by all means, but is critical. Which then leads me to this piece of the engage, not facilitate, right? There's this notion of the planners or architects getting in a room, facilitating community conversations, leaving with consensus. It's almost like a crystal ball. You peer into it, you're focused on it, you move around it, and you get the perfect future and you walk away. Well, that's not how it's going to work at all. And really, the biggest piece is that you need to engage in this engagement. And what that means is sort of getting your hands dirty, really having real conversations with folks, talking about what do you bring to the table in terms of expertise or knowledge or lived experience. How does that build into this work? And then also really understanding that you are a participant in that conversation, but at the same time being intentional that you might not face the consequences of those decisions in the same way as some of the people that you're working with, right? So having that in the back of your mind, understanding your own place in the conversation, but doing more than sort of just facilitating and placation and just sort of managing people. We have to move beyond that as planners and designers if we want to truly engage. Which brings me to this question of being honest and intentional, right? And it's a little bit of both, being honest with your own self and then being intentional in the way that we're going in and doing the work and being honest with other folks. So one of the things that often I see in community engagement exercises is sort of like, well, what do you want? And people sit there and talk about all the things that they want, right? There's a long history of things that they're not able to get, things that they want for a better quality of life, things that are crucial and critical. And then the planner sort of walks out of there and looks at their budget and is like, oh, well, I have $600,000, so I'm going to play around with this and think through what it looks like. And in some ways, that's not being honest. Honesty would be moving into a room and having the hard conversation of here's our resources, here's the structures and within which we are working, as unfair as they are, right? Either we can work together on moving some of these structures, removing some of these structures and goalposts, or you have that conversation on where we are and talk about a real conversation. So again, this is part of that realness of bringing your real self and authentic self to the table and also walking away with a real conversation that you've had. And again, the intentional piece is really important of making sure that we are intentional about the way we're creating and engaging in these processes. And what are our aims for this? And that's part of the honesty and intentionality. Is it simply that I've made up my mind and I have come to tell you what I want and I just want you to say yes? Or have I even just not even come to say that? I just want to go and tell someone else we did the community engagement, but I gave you my opinion. Or are you really in that space where you can have a real conversation on where to go from here? And sometimes you're not the person making those decisions, but you need to be honest about those decisions so that it's clear to the folks in the room what's happening. Essentially, do not waste people's time and their energies because folks put in a lot of themselves into this work from the community side when they come and engage in this work. So two-step, but I think an important and critical conversation, and I'm not going to hit on this too much because I know folks talk about this a lot in different spheres and we've looked at it, but we're looking at sort of justice and equity and not looking at parity and equality. So the idea is not to treat, do those broad things where everyone comes, everyone has the same amount of time, everyone gets to have an equal say in this conversation. but really looking at justice and equity. And equity would mean really making sure that there are equitable outcomes for people. So for me, that's critical in saying that would mean that somebody's race or ethnicity or other sort of intersectionalities of their identity are not leading to the outcomes that they're facing. And that is key for me in terms of how I look at equity and ensuring that that's crucial, not equality, but really ensuring that those pieces and facets of who they are not impacting their outcomes in life, which structure inequity makes sure that they are different. And then justice is really talking about goes beyond that and looks at the structures that have led to these inequities and talks of a more deeper and historical conversations that includes, work on reparations, work on decolonization, work on divestment, work on decarceration, right? And all of those pieces together. So really looking at the structural pieces. And those may not be what are impacting our work in a specific moment or project, but at the same time, those structural pieces are important. And so when we're coming into this work, we should be coming from, a belief in justice and equity and not parity and equality, which is partially, to be honest, where our code of ethics really talk about us treating people equally and with sort of dignity. And this then brings, I've covered this somewhat, but really just want to highlight this again as its own piece, that we need to lead with racial and social justice. And that can look, different in different contexts because there are different histories and different lived experiences and different narratives within different parts of the country and different parts of the globe. But really leading with that racial and social justice aspect is so important. Understanding that race has been one of the biggest impactors of outcomes, particularly in this country and continent, but also throughout the world. And that goes sort of the myriad ways of looking at the racialization of people historically in the world. And this then brings me to this piece of avoid emotional avoidance. Part of the conversation that sometimes is tricky and scary is that folks are, particularly as a white person. So I'll speak this, the conversations I've had with my friends and what I've observed, not having lived experience as a white person, but essentially folks are afraid of being shouted at by people of color. You get in front of a room of people and the neighborhood just tells you you're racist, you don't know what you're doing, you don't live here. And so there's sort of this fear and emotional avoidance that is true. Those are real emotions. But at the same time, if we're going to do this work, we have to work in those hard situations. We need to listen to the music. We need to work with those communities, and we need to understand our own place within the larger trajectory of history. And so by avoiding that emotional avoidance, we can truly be honest in the work that we're trying to do, right? Not be that person in the corner of the room who's like standing there with their arms folded and just like rolling their eyes, because that then is not part of that honest engagement that we're talking about. And then really understanding what you bring to the table, right? So part of this conversation we've seen, I'm seeing in a lot of different places. I was having this conversation with a colleague who, is engaged in a lot of the grassroots work with me. And we were talking about how we're seeing this conversation about like, oh, well, that I cannot like tell the community what to do, which means I should not share what I know or what I can do. And the community makes all the decisions and talks, right? But as planners and architects, we have certain expertise that we can bring to the table. And I'm saying the table, understanding that the table itself is completely unjust, right? For lack of a better word. But we bring certain expertise. And the idea is to see how we can use our own knowledge, expertise, learning, and practice and engage with the work that the communities are trying to do in a meaningful way and moving forward. The idea is not just to step back and just sort of listen, but really to engage. Again, going back to that engaging piece and not just facilitating piece. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to leave it open to questions. And I'm nearly coming on to that 40-minute mark. I'm going to stop sharing so I can look at folks. I know I just went through a lot of different pieces in a lot of different ways, and hopefully it wasn't too rushed, but I was trying to stay within the time. And what I really wanted was to have an engaging conversation with the folks here.
Thank you so much, Awais. Does anyone have a question right off the bat that they would like to pose? Feel free to turn on your cameras or speak up? I see a hand up from Audrey.
Hi, Awais. I was wondering how you personally navigate loud voices and soft voices in a space, either like in a literal room or just like organization power and things like that.
So just to make sure that I answered correctly, can you talk a little bit about what your understanding of soft and loud voices is?
Yeah, so from public participation, the way that I've understood it is that you hear some people in the room who will be literally louder than everyone else. And so it might come to everyone in the room might be getting this kind of bias, like, oh, that's how everyone is feeling. And maybe they don't feel like they should speak up or say how they feel because the louder or more powerful voices are louder is a way to say it. And how can you bring the quieter voices or the people who have less representation out from like the shadows, essentially?
So I think the first, I'll speak from the facilitation perspective and then sort of talk about designing and setting things up perspective. Partially this comes to sort of how you facilitate a conversation. I know I said we're not supposed to facilitate, but essentially how do we handle the conversations or lead the conversations? And one of those things really is that, again, right, like being that person who strongly tells people that, you've sort of had your word, let other folks speak, or asking folks who have not spoken to speak up and engage in those conversations. I've intentionally done that over the years where I try to do that, or when I'm having a conversation like that, I make sure that I'm tell people at the very start to say, some of you will try to speak. I'm not going to see you out of the corners of my eye if we're sitting in a circle or in a space where it's hard to see. So really just like try to catch my attention, or someone else tell me, hey, you missed what this person is trying to say. So I think part of that is how do we facilitate that piece when we're having that conversation? That's one thing. The other one is also the way we structure the way we do engagement. And part of that is essentially, again, not doing these sort of large room where we get disparate conversations together and put them all in like a cage and say, fight it out with each other. And I'm going to sit here and take notes in a corner. And so the way I've thought about this is, the work that I've done with neighborhoods is really, I've met with different neighborhoods. I don't even know how many meetings I've done, right? There are multiple meetings, sort of understanding, part of it is building that relationship with people as I've gone along, right? So it's not like a one-time touch base or just like, helicoptering into a community and then leaving when you're done with the work that you're trying to do, sort of building that relationship and then having those deep conversations with folks where I can really engage in those pieces in a smaller group where I'm talking about certain neighborhood representatives. That is not to mean that I do not, talk to other sides, but really having those multiple conversations and then perhaps having a conversation on bringing them together. But there's really no sort of way to bring everybody in the room in one go, get the answers we need and leave. It's much more intentional, long-term, and hard. But I think that's a really good point on that soft voices between loud voices. How do we sort of take them forward? Because it is important to engage with people in the work they're trying to do. And I would also say, and this is going to get a little too much, right? I'm not saying this is easy to do, but part of that is often a one-on-one touching base as well, right? Like when I facilitate a conversation, I've gone to folks afterwards and the loud ones and the soft ones, right? So the loud ones, to hear it out, often folks are coming from, a place where there's either they have very strong opinions or they've had an experience or part of what they're going through is a big piece of the conversation. So having the conversation to really tell folks like, I hear what you're saying, but we can have a more meaningful conversation with other folks. And then the soft folks, to be honest, always come up to you afterwards anyways. I feel like anybody who's ever been in a community or a conversation or even a talk, once you walk away, there's folks who come and talk to you who didn't ask you a question. And so, there's a way to have a meaningful conversation over there as well. So essentially, the biggest piece I can tell you is relationship building over time, but in an honest way, not a tokenizing where we're not willing to challenge people in a moment.
Next, we have a question from Charlie.
Hey, I missed the first part of your talk, but I appreciate what you were saying. And that last question actually makes me think about something that I feel like comes up a lot in especially online classroom settings, but that challenge of like including all voices in the classroom, I think is a similar situation to what you're talking about in the community. And I wonder, it's great when we can actually, through a class, go out into a community and put these ideas into practice. But I wonder if you also think about how teaching practices can embody these values in ways that you've experienced or imagined.
I completely agree. I feel like, teaching is part of it. I always laugh. I feel like it's definitely facilitating community conversations, and then it's part of it is the theater, standing in front and doing stuff with people. But there's things that we can do that are so intentional in the way we even facilitate classrooms or any conversation, right? And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm now going back to facilitation more than I should. But one of the ways, for example, is learning people's names. We know a lot of folks struggle with this, learning the people that you're going to spend 14, 15 weeks with. It's important, right? Like you need to know who they are and understanding and have those authentic relationships with people. And those authentic relationships last after, making sure that we're encouraging folks who are not always speaking up or talking to see where they are, but also understanding that there's going to be days somebody has a bad day, they just want to sit in the back and not engage. And we need to honor that sort of emotion that day as well, right? Folks who generally engage. So I think there's lots of ways of bringing this into the way we run classrooms and the kind of facilitation that happens in a classroom. And some of that is, again, similar things of engaging, being honest, being intentional in the work that we're trying to do. Right? One of the big honesty is saying, I don't have the answers. Like I gave this presentation and I was like, there's no cookie cutter way to tell you how to do this. And I don't know the way either. I'm struggling with everybody here. So I hope that sort of answers part of your question, what you were hitting at.
I have a question, although I can't raise my hand as the meeting host. So if I might jump in, this kind of builds on the first two questions. And I think it's sort of a question that's sort of existential, like, understanding that you are trying to reach as many different individuals who create smaller communities, who then create a bigger community as possible, and that you are also coming to these conversations with your own kind of background and set of assumptions. It seems like this kind of work requires like a real sensitivity. I mean, just noticing body language, noticing who's there in a certain way one day and they're in a certain way another day. Does this work is there a fundamental part of it that requires that you accept sort of the uncertainty that you may not get it right all the time, or that you may leave someone out or leave a certain group of people out? And if that does happen and you realize, how do you deal with that?
I would say 150% of the time. Be ready to know that you did not do the best. Be ready to know you made a bunch of mistakes. Be ready to sort of learn and move forward, and also know that we don't have all the answers by any means. And slightly different context, but an example I always give is I was part of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at the LBJ School when I did my master's. We worked on this sort of like 2-year plan to create a really big cohesive plan on diversity and inclusion in the school. We did a big town hall. And in this town hall, a student who's an amazing disability justice advocate gets up and tells us, and has also lived experience with disabilities, gets up and essentially tells us that we've not been inclusive, right? So we talked about gender and race and sexuality and gender identity and ethnicity and nationality. We talked about all these different things as a student group of leaders. And she calls us out in front of 250 people, and I'm standing there with one other person representing, right? And the first instinct in my mind was to say, well, we've had these meetings all this time. They were open. You could have come. You should have been part of these conversations. Anybody can come and say, we've never stopped anybody. And then, right, like a moment of reflection of quickly thinking, well, that's not how this works. That's not how the world works. That's not how this works. And so then really after that moment, I went up to her and had a conversation with her, took her out to lunch, talked if she could engage with the work, and then really made sure that not only just her voice, but really disability justice overall was built into that inclusion plan. And then it's something I've learned since then. And I now really that's something that pops into my mind when I'm talking about, right, like race and gender and disability and all the things that we have to take care of. So just having, being called out is not fun, but also being called out was a moment of my own learning and growth. And then again, to your point of reflection, of what are our own blinders, what are our own experiences that shape the work that we try to do, and how do we make it more meaningful going forward. So I think definitely it's a iterative learning process with hopefully a lot of reflection in the middle.
I think that's interesting that you bring up that example too, because I think that's something our school, that particular example is something, that's our school falls short there often, in these kinds of discussions. So I think that's important for all of us to think about too, but thank you very much.
And I guess, just before Jake goes, the emotional avoidance piece, I can tell you again, I bring that up as experience of getting called out of saying that you're discriminating against folks who are disabled in front of 250 people when you've been doing all this work is painful, right? But how do we take that emotional and not turn it into avoidance? How do we take those emotions and turn them into sort of growth? And it's a hard learning piece, but to acknowledge that those are difficult moments for anyone to bear. Sorry, Jake, you can go ahead.
Oh yeah, Awais, you've been doing a ton of reading on planning, history, and theory lately because we in the PhD program kind of made you do that for your comprehensive exam. So you've probably thought a lot about this, but as you were talking, I was kind of wondering, how did our field get to this place where we have such an unsophisticated view that there's like the community and all we have to do is just kind of go out there and find what the community thinks, when other fields like political science, since forever, they've had this idea that there's such a thing as pluralism and there are different interest groups and they have, they don't agree on things, but, politics is about kind of forming coalitions and to move forward. So like, how do we get to this place where you still come across this idea, like you said, that there is the community?
Wow, Jake, that's a tough one. And I hope you'll help me answer that question. Other folks will help answer that question as well. How we got here. I think I'm thinking of multiple things at the same time. I think in the most practical terms, I think we have not been intentional about scalar differences. So folks, I think, who very originally were doing really good engaged work with smaller groups of people, like working with, folks who were unhoused or working with, single women and things like that. We've tried to take those models and apply them to these large planning principles of we can just do the same with, the entire city of Austin. And I think that's part of the thing of not really remembering that these are contingent processes and contingent sort of ways in which we must engage with them. I think I'm thinking in terms of practical things, that's one thing. The other is, I think that sort of hard piece of how do you teach this, right? Teach this or write this or explain this to other people. You kind of end up oversimplifying the entire conversation. There's no way to teach this work without sort of really flattening it, getting rid of the grays, making it more black and white. And I think that in as well might be a tool of sharing what you know, but has over time really led to an imbalance where we've flattened out all of the nuance. And we've led to conversations that are not understanding of deep things. The other one, and I would say this, again, I should by the way premise this entire thing is just my opinions, right? This is not factual ways of thinking. A lot of the work on engagement has come from white people. And I think that's been one of the things that's changing, or I should basically say white cis hetero men of a certain income bracket are the ones who have defined how we did engagement, even though white women originally also of a certain income category were defining the work as well. And so what's happened is, I feel like we've gotten fewer voices from people of color or indigenous folks and Black folks. And I think that's beginning to change. I think that's part of the reason why we're being challenged to really step up in this moment as newer folks are engaging in this conversation. But I think that history of planning has come from those perspectives of white people, and then also the perspective of really top-down strategies, because a lot of the people who did that work were usually within cities, right? I'm thinking of the different pieces that have happened and the work that's happened. A lot of the scholars that talk about this kind of work are talking about like advocacy planning within departments and how do you do this sort of radical work within structures without ever acknowledging what those structures do and limit the ability to do the kind of work that you're doing. I hope that kind of answers your question. I don't know if you or other folks have thoughts on this. I would love to hear.
Well, let's talk about it some other time. We're here to hear from you.
Hand up from Ben, yeah.
Hi, Awais. Thank you so much for this presentation today. You mentioned in an answer a couple minutes ago about the need for like long-term engagement and really the kind of like relationship and trust building that gets to that deeper level of understanding what individuals and communities, what their values are, what their needs are and hopes are. But as you kind of presented in your slide deck, these projects, like engagement is usually roped into a particular project. And there's really a market around engagement that's all built around the idea that engagement is a part of a project. So you have your Project Connect engagement over here, your Colony Park engagement over here, and there's a huge gap in between. They never meet. In what way, like just very practically speaking, does that market shift in our expectation around longer term trust building? Like, where is a place for that?
I think that's a really good question, right? And it goes back to that piece of this slide that was talking about how often a lot of us are embedded in these structures when we're trying to do community engagement. And so there's always these limitations that will hold us back. We're not the people who make the decisions on when community engagement happens or how it happens or how much time we have. And it's almost always like you have a few months to do it. And so it becomes very meaningless in that way. So I think the first piece of that would be, I think in a more ideal world, the way we structure these conversations would be more long-term and relational, right? I feel like communities hate nothing more than when planners and city, folks come in the moment they need something from you or need information from you and kind of disappear for months, right? An example of this is Cap Metro, right? It's a good example. You come in, talk about Project Connect, and then people will for years talk about that bus stop that's not been fixed, or the bus stop doesn't have a shade, or doesn't have a bench, or there is no bus stop, or how there's not an intersection crossing there. And so just swooping in, having those conversations, leaving really does not build that long-term trust. So I think part of it is not just like as individuals, but as our own departments and structures and firms, we have continued relationships with people over time and we touch base with them, which can mean different things, right? It doesn't mean that you always have to go them for information, right? So Colony Park, I did the community engagement piece with them in 2014. And then I didn't really engage with them again on some other work until 2018, right? So there was this big gap in the middle. But in that big gap in the middle, if they had events there, I still went. They had a little, fair there. I still went. I met the neighbors. Whenever I would see them at somewhere else, I would say hello. And I think there's sort of that relationship building over time, lovely people, which made it so much more easier to form those relationships and keep them. But essentially, I think there's other touch points to have a more humane existence with people rather than having that differential between I'm the planner and you're the community. So I think, that piece being important, but at the same time, understanding sort of the limitations and how much we can do within those structures. But hopefully within our own fields, we can really start challenging that and saying, you know what, no, the 4 months is not enough. We cannot do community engagement on a complex issue that's going to impact the entire city in 4 months. Like, this is just not how this is done. So hopefully we can start holding people more accountable, holding structures more accountable, that we are part of ourselves.
Anyone else? Questions, comments? 12:59. Thank you so much. This was fabulous. And I am thinking ahead to events that I'm planning for next year. And I definitely want to bend your ear a little bit more. So I'll be in touch after this. But really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise with us. And hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for those great questions and for engaging with this.